Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 17 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers between weeks 10 through 16 in order to identify the most advantageous matchups going into the week, and what matchups we might want to avoid based on the cornerback coverage. After we cover that topic, we'll then transition into talking about our top 36 wide receiver rankings, as I'll share with you guys my opinions and the statistics that justify the rankings that I'll present to you guys on screen over the course of today's video. Before we begin, again, congratulations. If you're watching this video, you have made it to your Week 17 championship game. If you can do me a solid, go down to the comment section and type your entire roster down below so that I can go ahead, collect that information, and use that in order to correlate exactly which fantasy prospects have led many of us to the fantasy championships. I want to go ahead, put that data together, and provide that to you guys so that we're all on the same page as to what has gotten us here and potentially something we can repeat going into next year. After that, while you're down in the comment / description, if you guys are looking for a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description. Be sure to click the like button down there and also check out PrizePicks. There's a link down there. If you guys haven't yet already, be sure to go ahead, use promo code Andrew today, make that first time deposit because it's immediately doubled when using promo code Andrew up to $100. You can go ahead, pick more or less on given player statistics, perhaps some of the players that we mentioned on today's video, so you can go ahead, win some entries this upcoming weekend. Thank you very much. Outside of that, let's get into today's content, beginning with matchups at the wide receiver position for Week 17. As you can see to the right of me, I've gone ahead and collected the statistics in terms of total targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and correlated fantasy points that defenses have allowed to opposing wide receivers over the course of weeks 10 through 16. Again, like I've mentioned this in the past, even though your fantasy apps, whether it's Yahoo, whether it's NFL.com, ESPN, give you guys an indication of whether it's a great matchup or not, they're taking the entire spectrum of the season into account, weeks 1 through 16. When we go ahead and isolate statistics in this matter, that does not include rushing statistics, and on top of it is over the course of the last 2 months, it gives us a far better understanding as to which matchups we should be taking advantage of. Primarily the Minnesota Vikings, that is a fantastic matchup, followed by the Dallas Cowboys, Detroit Lions, Tennessee Titans. They are the worst secondaries in terms of the National Football League, in terms of giving up yardage to opposing wide receivers, and of course, a boatload of touchdowns. Looking at just the Cowboys, giving up 13 touchdowns in the last couple of games. Unfortunately, on Thursday Night Football, we won't be able to take advantage of it because the insanity that is taking place already this week, with the conversations revolving Derrick Henry and majority of those studs within the Tennessee Titans, lineup, whether it's offensively or defensively, not playing on Thursday night. Now, besides the chaos that has ensued there's also the Las Vegas Raiders, who are shutting down Derek Carr for the remainder of the season because they don't want him to get injured and have to owe him money. They're going to go ahead and cut him as soon as the season is done. All of that certainly playing a factor. And of all the weeks for this to happen, of course, Week 17, when all the marbles are on the line for us trying to capture a 2022 fantasy football championship. Either way, on the other end of the spectrum, in regards to wide receiver fantasy points allowed, we have the Atlanta Falcons, New York Jets, Pittsburgh Steelers, Washington Commanders, Houston Texans, who have been playing very good football over the course of the last couple weeks. I mean, just looking at the number of receptions allowed by the Falcons secondary, I mean, in comparison to earlier this year, it's a complete 180 switch. They were one of the best matchups in a weekly given basis that we wanted to take advantage of. As of late, certainly hasn't been the case. But either way, Minnesota, obviously we want to take care of that matchup. Allen Lazard, Christian Watson, we'll see how the health resides. But speaking of the Minnesota Vikings, let's transition into talking about the top 36 wide receiver rankings, beginning with our number one, and it's Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. The reason why I wanted to transition in this factor is because the fact of the matter is, Justin Jefferson's a stud. You're automatically starting him. He currently has 1,756 receiving yards. He is 208 receiving yards away from tying and or potentially surpassing Calvin Johnson's record for most receiving yards in a singular season. He could very easily, in my mind, accomplish this week, mainly because in the last 2 games that he has taken on the Green Bay Packers secondary, with Kirk Cousins as his starting quarterback. In the first game, 8 catches, 169, 2 touchdowns, 33.2 fantasy points. And in the other game earlier this season, week 1, 9 catches, 184, 2 touchdowns, 34.9 fantasy points. Justin Jefferson will be bringing home fantasy championships in 2022, and that is a given based on the matchup this upcoming week against Jair Alexander, who has struggled and had a tough time with Justin Jefferson over the course of the last couple of years. Justin Jefferson, an automatic play, and hopefully wins us a championship. Moving on to CeeDee Lamb, our number 2, taking on the Tennessee Titans secondary. Again, like I mentioned earlier in regards to the matchup portion of today's video, the Tennessee Titans are not going to be starting majority of their defensive starters, and of course Derrick Henry, which is pretty much their entire offense. But the reason why I want to mention this is because it only grants more opportunity for a stud like CeeDee Lamb to put up incredible points early in that game. Now, later on in the game, he may end up sitting because they're blowing out the Tennessee Titans by halftime. But we got to remember, in the last 8 games that CeeDee Lamb has played, 6 of those performances consist of 14.5 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. He has scored 6 touchdowns in the last 8 games, and not only that, he has had 4 games out of those 8 with 100 or more receiving yards. The last 2 games in specific, 120 plus receiving yards in each of those contests. I'm expecting a huge overall upside week here for CeeDee Lamb. Like I mentioned last week, he's getting more and more utilization in the slot position, and that's exactly what we saw them utilize him against the Philadelphia Eagles. Going up against Avonte Maddox, he played 80% of his offensive snaps in the slot position and dominated, and that's why he was so successful. Going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against Tennessee, who is giving up 1.29 receiving touchdowns per game since week 10, I'm expecting a huge overall upside week for CeeDee Lamb. Moving on to Tyreek Hill, our number 3. Even if Tua Tagovailoa is not going to be the starting quarterback, you have to understand that the matchup and Teddy Bridgewater can certainly help benefit the overall upside of Tyreek Hill. Let's talk about the matchup in specific, because of course we want to focus on that, because those are the guys that are going to try to prevent Tyreek Hill from scoring fantasy points. Now, in the last 5 games that Tyreek Hill has taken on the New England Patriots, whether it was earlier this season or whether it was with his tenure with the Kansas City Chiefs, in the last 5 games, he's averaging 9.2 targets, 6.4 receptions, 99 receiving yards per game, and 1 total touchdown per game, which is a 19.48 half PPR fantasy point per game average against that organization. Now, earlier this year, in week 1, 14 fantasy points, 8 catches, 94 yards with Tua under center. Now, the question is, when we get into the conversation of adding Teddy Bridgewater as the starting quarterback of this organization, is that going to help benefit Tyreek Hill's overall upside? In the 2 games that we have seen Teddy Bridgewater actively play in this lineup, we have seen in the Cincinnati game in which he came in to relieve Tua, who was, of course, carted off, unfortunately, but he came in and immediately looked in the direction of Tyreek Hill. In the remainder of that game, Tyreek Hill had 8 targets, 6 catches, 109. The following week after that, against the Minnesota Vikings, we saw 15 targets, 12 receptions, 177 receiving yards from Teddy Bridgewater going in the direction of Tyreek Hill for 23.7 fantasy points. There's a lot of upside with that quarterback wide receiver combo. The matchup's fantastic. He's an automatic play. Moving on to Ja'Marr Chase on number 4. Ja'Marr Chase last week very easily should have had himself a 40-yard reception on top of his overall total baseline of score. If not, he was able to potentially turn that 40-yard reception, if he had made it, into a 59-yard touchdown. It was on the table when I was watching that game back. Very easily could have broke the tackle after the fact, but he dropped it. No big deal. Like I mentioned last week, Belichick looked to try to go ahead and remove the number 1 option within the Bengals offense. That's exactly why we saw guys like T. Higgins and, of course, Irwin scoring touchdowns in that game, and Ja'Marr Chase not really finding much end zone help in that factor. Either way, Ja'Marr Chase is one of the best wide receivers in the league. He'll take on Tre'Davious White this upcoming week, who has been a shell of himself, obviously coming off the ACL, which isn't really a surprise. He isn't the cornerback that he used to be, which will honestly, in my opinion, go ahead and give another great advantage for Ja'Marr Chase that he'll be able to take advantage of going into the week. Moving on to Keenan Allen at number 5. He's been playing out of his mind. And quite frankly, he's playing exactly the way we anticipated him to play, prior to the injury that he's, sustained very early in the season. That all being said, from weeks 12 through 16, Keenan Allen is averaging 11.6 targets, 8.4 receptions, 84 receiving yards, and 0.4 receiving touchdowns per game, which is a 14.98 half PPR fantasy point per game average. In the last 4 games alone, 51 targets and 37 receptions. Incredible numbers. Now, the question is, the matchup against the LA Rams, is it going to be too difficult for a guy like Keenan Allen? We know he's one of the best route runners in the league, but when we're talking about Kobe Durant and, of course, Jalen Ramsey, who love to cover in the nickel position within the Rams defense, there is a conversation to be had as to whether or not Keenan Allen is going to have the most potential for upside. The reason why I have him at number 5 is because I truly believe no one can guard Keenan Allen. He's one of the best in the league. It is going to be the battle for LA between the LA Rams and the LA Chargers. I'm pretty sure there was a movie called Battle Los Angeles. It was probably terrible. I'm pretty sure I remember this. Someone can confirm that in the comment section. But either way, it should be a fun game between these 2 LA teams. Keenan Allen should be dominating. Moving on, let's talk about Stefon Diggs. The age-old phrase of winning cures everything really does encapsulate the last 3 weeks for Stefon Diggs. We know Stefon Diggs at times is a wide receiver that on the sideline will make it apparent that Josh Allen is not getting him the ball. He will complain about it because he knows he's one of the best on the field and deserves more targets. The fact of the matter is, The last 3 games have combined 16 total targets, 10 receptions, 123 through the air, 0 touchdowns, and only 17 fantasy points. For many of us who had Stefon Diggs, you may not even be in the fantasy playoffs, and I may be just literally talking to no one at this point. But for those of you who still have him, I still have hope left out there going up against the Cincinnati Bengals, and specifically Eli Apple. I think Stefon Diggs should be able to take advantage of this matchup. But the fact of the matter is, this team is on like a 6-game winning streak, and because of that, Stefon Diggs really can't complain. They keep winning. And even without him having, incredible numbers, they don't need him to have, incredible numbers every single game. Hopefully, this week, he'll be able to go ahead, step up to the task at hand, going up against a team that very easily could be meeting them in the AFC Championship game. We'll have to wait and see. But Stefon Diggs, if he's active, he's in my lineup. Moving on to A.J. Brown on number 7. A.J. Brown, coming off of a week where he had 103 receiving yards, 6 receptions with a backup quarterback, now has an opportunity of taking on the New Orleans Saints. But here's the thing. When I talk about A.J. Brown, I also want to talk about DeVonta Smith, who is the thumbnail for today's episode. I think talking about both these guys with Gardner Minshew in the lineup is just an automatic. The fact of the matter is, whether it's been with Jalen Hurts or with Gardner Minshew, this offense has been torching defenses over the course of the last 4 weeks. I mean, when we talk about A.J. Brown's last 4 performances, 27.9, 15.0, 22.6, and 13.3.5 PPR. Look at DeVonta Smith in the last 4 games. 18.7, 14.9, 15.1, 27.3 with Gardner Minshew. Both of these wide receivers are must-starts going into the given week, and I understand that the matchup against the New Orleans Saints is certainly more difficult than going up against the Dallas Cowboys secondary that has been torched over the course of the last 2 months based on the injuries that they have sustained in the secondary. But in my opinion, going into this given weekend's matchup, DeVonta Smith, yes, was able to come down with 2 touchdowns against the Dallas Cowboys, but what's to say that, A.J. Brown won't be the guy this week? I think these guys are both automatic plays, regardless of who's playing at quarterback, and it is assumed that it's going to be Gardner Minshew. These guys are absolute must-starts in the given week. Moving on to T. Higgins, another wide receiver from the Cincinnati Bengals. Of course, T. Higgins really did benefit from the fact that it's a matter of pick your poison. If you want to go ahead and shut down a guy like Ja'Marr Chase, then you're going to have to feel the pain of 8 catches, 128, and a touchdown. That's exactly what the New England Patriots secondary felt. That being said, T. Higgins has been extremely consistent as of late. In the last 4 healthy games that he has played, he has scored a singular touchdown minimum in those contests. He's getting himself more and more red zone targets. And in fact, this last week very easily could have had himself a second touchdown. A 4-yard fade obviously didn't end up bringing down the ball, but there's an opportunity there that was granted. They continue to look to him down in the red zone, and if that's going to continue to be the case, going up against Buffalo, a higher scoring matchup, should be an automatic play. Moving on. Amon-Ra St. Brown. If you guys remember this time last year, Amon-Ra St. Brown secured many of us fantasy championships. And hopefully this upcoming Sunday, he will return with gifts as such, where he's going to put up an incredible performance going up against the Chicago Bears secondary that is one of the worst in the National Football League. Now, even though they don't give up much points, it's primarily because a lot of teams just choose to run the ball on them, and the damage that is done there typically kills a lot of the clock after teams have pretty much mounted a lead on this defense. That being said, Amon-Ra St. Brown has had 7 consecutive performances of 10 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. The only difference as to whether or not Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be an 11 to 12 point wide receiver or potentially an 18 point wide receiver in a half PPR is that singular touchdown. The fact of the matter is, in the last 3 weeks, Amon-Ra St. Brown has been the number 1 red zone target within this offense, having himself 10 total opportunities, whether it is, targets and or rushing attempts in the red zone. As long as he continues to lead this team in terms of red zone opportunities, he's going to continue to have upside. Earlier this season in week 10 against the Chicago Bears, 10 catches, 119, and 17.1 fantasy points. I'm expecting a huge game here from Amon-Ra St. Brown. Moving on to Jaylen Waddle, another one of these second-year wide receivers that is playing out of their minds. Now, again, whether it's Tua or whether it's Teddy Bridgewater, it does not bother me. I truly do believe that Jaylen Waddle is going to have himself an incredible upside game. Now, in the last couple of weeks, a little bit of the momentum has been built in favor of Jaylen Waddle's fantasy production with 18.9 and 22.8 fantasy point performances. Incredible numbers in the last 2 weeks. But the fact of the matter is, when you add Teddy Bridgewater into the lineup, is that going to make an impact that is negatively going to potentially affect Jaylen Waddle? If you go back to that Cincinnati Bengals game, Jaylen Waddle was injured in that game in the first place, so I did not expect him to get more utilization when Teddy Bridgewater came into the game to relieve Tua. Therefore, not really a big deal. But the following week against the Minnesota Vikings, when Jaylen Waddle was fully healthy, with Teddy Bridgewater at quarterback, 10 targets, 6 catches, 129, and 13.9 fantasy points. Obviously fumbled in that game, could have had himself an even better performance, but either way, a lot of potential upside there. On top of the fact, the matchup on hand, going up against the New England Patriots, in the last 3 games, Jaylen Waddle's taken on this defense, 15.7, 14.1, 11.2, 1 touchdown minimum in each of those last 3 contests. I expect a lot of success, whether it's with Teddy Bridgewater or Tua Tagovailoa this week. Moving on, let's talk about the final of our wide receiver ones. It is Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin has been very consistent as of late. Now, the last time he took on the Carolina Panthers, he had himself a very, I guess you could say, relatively inconsistent game. 13 targets, only 7 catches and 43 yards, only 8 fantasy points. But since then, from weeks 8 through 16, the guy has been the number 14 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format, averaging 10 targets per game, 7.5 receptions, 69 receiving yards, and 0.4 receiving touchdowns per game, which is 12.95 half PPR fantasy points per game. Pretty good numbers overall across the board, which pretty much aligns him in this number 12 spot pretty consistently. Now, the question is, can he go ahead and have himself an upside performance going up against the Carolina Panthers, a matchup which will certainly determine whether or not we are going to potentially see whether it's the Carolina Panthers and or the Tampa Bay Buccaneers specifically winning the NFC South. Now, there is a lot of conversation regarding J.C. Horn. He has gone down with an injury. He had wrist surgery that may put an emphasis on utilizing more Mike Evans. But if Mike Evans starts to pull more attention on the outside, it's only going to make it that much easier for Chris Godwin to cook, over the middle of the field. Last week we saw Amon-Ra St. 7 catches, 76 yards against this defense. I think that's a base minimum for Chris Godwin's potential in the given week. Moving on, let's talk about Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett hopefully will be active this week. Now, again, rankings are subject to change, and by Sunday morning, when I will be live streaming from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, ready to give you guys rankings up to date on screen for all 4 primary positions, kickers and defenses included. The question is going to be whether or not he's going to be ready to go. Now, from the report that I read just an hour prior to, of course, recording this right now, it was in regards to Pete Carroll being very confident and optimistic as to whether or not Tyler Lockett was going to be available for them this week. Pete Carroll did decline to give a definitive answer as to whether he was going to play, but he did say that he participated fully in today's Wednesday practice. Therefore, it gives me a lot of confidence coming off the index finger injury broken from a couple weeks ago. I mean, again, prior to that injury, the guy had a 6-game consecutive streak of scoring a touchdown, at least one touchdown in each of those games. So getting back into our lineups should be an automatic 14-plus point fantasy performance in my mind, especially if he finds the end zone. But the question is he going to be healthy? Moving on, let's talk about Jerry Jeudy, our number 14. Here's the fact of the matter. Regardless of what Denver Broncos offense we are going to witness, post Nathaniel Hackett era, it is still going to be a pass-heavy scheme going up against the Kansas City offense that is probably going to be putting up a pretty good chunk of points. Therefore, in order to keep up with them, we're going to see Jerry Jeudy get himself a lot of targets. In the last 3 weeks, Jerry Jeudy has been the number 1 receiving option of this offense with 27 total targets. That's 9 per week on average. The last time he took on this defense, if you guys don't remember, 8 receptions, 73 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and 29.3 fantasy points. Career high numbers for him in regards to fantasy. Going into this weekend's matchup, I'm expecting big performance here out of Jerry Jeudy. Moving on, let's talk about DJ Moore, a guy that has been extremely consistent since we have seen Sam Darnold take over as the starting quarterback of this organization. And quite frankly, they have been on a pretty hot winning streak here over the course of the last couple weeks here. Now, the question is DJ Moore going to be able to step up to the task at hand and put up great numbers against a division rival like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? Now, if you remember earlier this season, week 7, against Tampa Bay, even with PJ Walker at quarterback, 7 receptions, 69 yards, a receiving touchdown, 16.1 fantasy points, which quite frankly, in terms of fantasy point total, looks very familiar with the overall performances we have seen attributed in the direction of DJ Moore fantasy managers based on his performances with Sam Darnold. The last 4 games, 18.3, 0.6, obviously a very underwhelming performance, but outside of that, we also had a performance of 15.8 and 17.6. So outside of the one fluke performance, 15 plus fantasy points in the last 3 games with Sam Darnold. Incredible numbers. Hopefully this is going to be an exciting game going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary that is certainly dealing with a lot of injuries. Moving on to Terry McLaurin, number 16. Now we're getting into a conversation here where the last couple players that we've mentioned are kind of playing with backup quarterbacks. And we continue with the backup quarterback conversation regarding Carson Wentz being named the starter for the Washington Commanders going into this given week. Now, earlier this season, from weeks 1 through 6, when Carson Wentz was the starting quarterback, we saw Terry McLaurin put together 10.2, 13.2, 2.5, 10.1, 6.7 fantasy points. That 6.7 fantasy point performance obviously was the week where Carson Wentz had a broken thumb hand, whatever the heck he had that, landed him on the injured reserve. But prior to that, 4 to the 5 performances were 10 or more fantasy points. I'm hoping that we're going to get a high level of Carson Wentz. The fact of the matter is, when I watched back that game, as soon as Carson Wentz came into the game, he was funnel targeting Curtis Samuel and Logan Thomas. Hopefully, we're going to see a little bit more love going in the direction of Terry McLaurin, which we certainly have seen earlier this season. But going up against Cleveland in Washington should be a fantastic matchup for him going into the given week. Moving on, let's talk about DeAndre Hopkins. The performance of last week, I went and I did some digging. 10 targets, 1 catch, 4 receiving yards for DeAndre Hopkins. Is the first time that he has had 1 reception in a game since 2016. If you want to guess who his quarterback was, it was Brock Osweiler. So the fact of the matter is, these fluke performances, they occur with bad quarterbacks, and Tracy McSorley was exactly that. So hopefully going into this week with Colt McCoy clearing the concussion protocol, we're going to get back to the conversation in which earlier this season we have seen DeAndre Hopkins with Colt McCoy averaging about 8 receptions, 80 receiving yards per game, getting himself into that 12-point range with the upside of a touchdown. We'll keep our fingers crossed, but again, he takes on the Atlanta Falcons, one of the more tougher matchups, but he's a stud wide receiver. Doesn't matter who's covering him. As long as the ball is delivered properly and accurately, he should be a fantastic play. Moving on, let's talk about DK Metcalf. The reason why I have DK Metcalf as low as I do, despite the fact that he is the Terminator in my eyes, is the fact that he takes on Sauce Gardner. Sauce Gardner has shut down everyone this season. And even though I will objectively say that DK Metcalf is built differently, the fact of the matter is, sometimes it doesn't matter. I've seen him produce well against Jalen Ramsey, but Sauce Gardner is something else, man. He really has an island over there, and if they're going to continue to lock down DK Metcalf, I'm not saying that he's going to be held without a catch or without putting up decent fantasy points. I still have him at number 18, but there isn't as much upside in my mind in the given matchup. Moving on, let's talk about the second half of the wide receiver conversation. Speaking of the New York Jets and Sauce Gardner, let's talk about the other rookie that the New York Jets certainly hit on. It's Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson has an opportunity of taking on the Seattle Seahawks, and the reason why I have him at number 19 primarily has to also do with cornerback coverage. Tyreek Woolen, another rookie cornerback who honestly should be in the conversation with Sauce Gardner in terms of defensive rookie of the year. But the fact of the matter is, he's pretty much shut down everybody in terms of outside wide receivers over the course of the last couple weeks. I mean, if you look at just like the last, I would probably say since week 8, there's only been one wide receiver that has played primarily on the outside, that being Davante Adams, that has gone for over 70 receiving yards in a singular game. So Davante Adams is the only successful wide receiver since week 8 on the outside that we have seen go up against his defense. Now, hopefully Garrett Wilson will get more utilization in the slot, kind of get away from Tyreek Woolen, but if he's not going to be able to, even with Mike White there, and even though in the last 3 games with Mike White, the dude is averaging 10 targets, 6.3 receptions, 112 receiving yards, and 0.67 receiving touchdowns per game, which is 18.3 fantasy points, that streak of success may come to an end going up against one of these better rookie cornerbacks in the given year. Moving on to Amari Cooper at number 20. The reason why I have Amari Cooper in this conversation is because for some reason he has a vendetta against the Washington Commanders. He has made a legitimate career out of dominating that secondary. Just to put it in perspective, from 2019 through 2021, he has averaged 17.43 fantasy points per game against the Washington Commanders. 7 games, 6 total touchdowns. Incredible numbers across the board. Now, speaking of touchdowns, unfortunately, Amari Cooper dropped a touchdown in that game against the Saints this last week. Even though he was able to get himself 6 receptions on 10 targets and 72 receiving yards, should have had an additional 12-yard receiving touchdown wide open in the back of the end zone. Obviously, I could put fault on both these players. He dropped it. It was a very low targeted pass by Deshaun Watson. Both are at fault in my mind, but either way, we could have seen a huge influx of 8 fantasy points on top of his overall production. The targets are going up, and going into a far better weather condition in this given week should be a fantastic play. Moving on, let's talk about our number 21, Davante Adams. I know many of you were wondering, where is Davante Adams, Andrew? With Derek Carr being shut down and Jarrett Stidham being the starting quarterback, I have a very difficult time starting any sort of Las Vegas Raiders prospect. Specifically, Davante Adams, Darren Waller, Josh Jacobs. All 3 of those guys, I'm having a tough time in terms of ranking them. Therefore, I have Davante Adams at 21 because I give him the benefit of the doubt because he is Davante Adams. We have seen him produce well with guys like, you go back to 2017 with guys like Brett Hundley. But the fact of the matter is, in the last 3 games, Davante Adams has contributed 9 total receptions on 25 targets, 114 receiving yards, and 15.9 fantasy points to our teams. So can we trust that the quarterback switch going up against the San Francisco 49ers defense is going to make a huge difference? Sure. Davante Adams has a huge track record against the San Francisco 49ers. Similar to the way that Amari Cooper has made a career taking on the Washington Commanders, I believe this to be the case for Davante Adams going up against the 49ers. In the last 6 games that he's taken on that defense, he's averaging 21.88 fantasy points per game, which is 118 receiving yards, 0.83 receiving touchdowns, and 9.5 receptions per game. Incredible numbers across the board, on top of the fact that the 49ers have struggled against opposing wide receivers, allowing 3 receiving touchdowns last week to opposing wide receivers, Dotson with 1, Curtis Samuel, and Terry McLaurin. It's an advantageous matchup. If they did not bench Derek Carr, I feel far more confident in Davante Adams would be a top 6 wide receiver, but unfortunately, that is not the case. Moving on, speaking of the Washington Commanders, let's talk about Jahan Dotson. Speaking of him scoring touchdowns, in the last 3 games, he has scored a minimum of 1 touchdown in each of those 3 contests, and luckily because of the opportunities he's been given. 9, 6, and 9 targets in the last 3 games, leading to 13.9, 18.5, and 16.6 fantasy points. But the fact of the matter is, we are transitioning from the Taylor Heineke era to now back to Carson Wentz. Luckily, we've seen a lot of great performances from a guy like Jahan Dotson, the rookie wide receiver, with Carson Wentz earlier this year. Weeks 1 through 4, prior to Jahan Dotson's hamstring injury, the performances with Carson Wentz consisted of 16.5, 15.9, 2.0, and 11.8 fantasy points. Perhaps I'm being a little too optimistic in terms of my overall ranking of Jahan Dotson, but I truly do believe he has a nose for the end zone and we'll be able to find it this upcoming week. Moving on to JuJu Smith-Schuster. JuJu, the last time he took on the Denver Broncos in week 14, 11 targets, 9 catches, 74 yards, a receiving touchdown, 17.9 fantasy points. Depending on what Denver defense shows up, I mean, again, if the Rams could score 51 on the Denver defense, why not the Kansas City Chiefs? I truly do believe that even though JuJu Smith-Schuster is coming off a very underwhelming performance against the Houston Texans, Houston's got a pretty good secondary. We know that Desmond King is a lockdown corner. Therefore, we would then technically play JuJu Smith-Schuster under the assumption that the Denver Broncos are crushed. Their spirit is crushed, and Patrick Surtain's maybe not trying as hard as he potentially could, and allow JuJu a couple more fantasy points than usual. Moving on, let's talk about our number 4, Drake London, to close out our wide receiver 2 conversation. Drake London has played very well over the course of the last 2 weeks with Desmond Ridder under center. In fact, in the last 2 weeks, has combined for 20 total targets, 14 receptions, 166 receiving yards. Unfortunately, has had 2 fumbles, one in each of those 2 games, which has lowered his overall fantasy point contribution in a half PPR to 19.6 fantasy points. Otherwise, this guy's 10 plus fantasy points each of the last 2 weeks based on his contributions. So with that taken into account, and the fact that Budda Baker is down with an injury, Byron Murphy is still missing within this defense, and Marco Wilson is also dealing with an injury and may end up missing for the Arizona Cardinals this upcoming Sunday, there's a conversation to be had for Drake London absolutely being a top 24 prospect, if not better, if Desmond Ridder steps up to the task at hand. Moving on to DJ Chark, number 25. Chark has played very well. I mean, just looking at the last couple weeks, weeks 12 through 16, he's put up an 8.6, 12.3, 18.4, and 12.8 point performance. 4 pretty solid performances, yet there was one extra game that I didn't mention. It was a 2.3 point performance against the New York Jets. Anybody playing up against Sauce Gardner on the outside obviously hasn't played well. But when we look at the last 4 weeks, and we take into account, of course, he had to face Sauce Gardner in one of those weeks, the other 3 games are 94 or more receiving yards in each of those contests. I'm expecting a huge performance out of DJ Chark. Even though we expect the Jameson Williams to potentially find value, this is exactly what the Detroit Lions' MO has been this season. Yeah, we have DeAndre Swift back and healthy. And yes, we have Jameson Williams also back and healthy. Yet we've decided to go ahead and use Jamal Williams and DJ Chark. I don't understand the logic, but either way, they'll continue to do so. And with the matchup up against the Chicago Bears, DJ Chark should be an automatic play. Moving on. Zay Jones is our number 26. Zay Jones up against the Houston Texans. I'm not too excited about it, even though he has been extremely consistent as of late. I think the coverage of Steven Nelson and, of course, Desmond King, it's not going to be easy. Therefore, even though I have seen Zay Jones in the last 6 games put up performances of 10.28, 22.0, 17.7, 31.6, he's also had those rough games of 2.6 fantasy points, 1.6 fantasy points. More often than not, he's putting up great performances. Therefore, we'll have him at number 26. But again, it's not 100% guaranteed that Zay Jones can step up into the matchup and be an automatic stud option in the top 24 capacity. Moving on to Allen Lazard and Christian Watson. I wanted to mention both of the Green Bay Packers wide receivers because, again, they do take on the Minnesota Vikings secondary. The Minnesota Vikings have allowed everyone to stay in games. They recently set the record for the most singular score victories in a single season for an NFL team. So, obviously, we're going to expect to see that the Green Bay Packers are going to score a lot of points, especially going up against the secondary, who's been torched by just about every wide receiver core. I mean, we're just talking about a week just last week where Daniel Jones, along with Richie James Jr., Darius Slayton, Isaiah Hodgins, all 3 of those receiving options torch that defense. I'm expecting to see huge numbers from guys like Allen Lazard and Christian Watson, assuming Christian Watson is healthy and active, of course, dealing with that hip flexor injury. If he is not going to be active, Allen Lazard alongside Romeo Doubs, Randall Cobb should be great plays, but we want to go ahead and hope that Christian Watson can be active and healthy and get a little bit of revenge from his week 1 dropped touchdown against Patrick Peterson that really could have started this entire upside of play from Christian Watson a long time ago. We know he is a red zone threat. They want to continue to get him touchdowns. He's just got to be healthy and ready to go. Otherwise, Lazard should be able to rack in a lot of overall opportunity. Moving on to Mike Evans, our number 29. Mike Evans is in a position where I trust him mainly on a couple bases. Now, let me give you guys a little bit of an understanding as to where I am getting this overall ranking from in terms of my mind. He takes on the Carolina Panthers. Earlier this season, week 7, took on the Panthers, 9 catches on 15 targets, 96 receiving yards, 14.1 fantasy points. Really, his entire slouch of his season began there when he dropped a wide open 60-yard touchdown. Now, the fact of the matter is, we are hopefully going to find ourselves a little bit of revenge here and get Mike Evans into the end zone, mainly because J.C. Horn, the primary number one cornerback of this defense, wrist surgery is going to be out. With that being the case, and the fact that in the last 5 games, Mike Evans has averaged 18.14 fantasy points per game up against this defense, putting up 14.1, 23.9, 19.9, 16.7, 16.1 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. I'm expecting to see a lot of production out of Mike Evans. And even though this season he has quite literally scored 10 less touchdowns than back in 2020 and in 2021, he is going to be on pace for having the most receptions, targets, and receiving yards with Tom Brady in comparison to the 2 prior years. Despite the fact that he is far less efficient in terms of fantasy points per game, in terms of receptions, opportunities, yards, he's there. The only thing that has eluded him this season has been touchdowns. And unfortunately, that is the biggest moneymaker in terms of Mike Evans' fantasy upside. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr., another player that, even though we are a little bit down on him because of the quarterback switch, and man, he has played with a lot of quarterbacks in his career, he's taken on a matchup up against the New York Giants. And if, in fact, Adoree Jackson is going to miss another consecutive game, every single number one wide receiver on the outside has dominated this defense, quite literally dominated this defense because of the absence of Adoree Jackson. If, in fact, we get another week here where there is no Adoree Jackson, Michael Pittman Jr. very easily is a top 30 wide receiver, if not better, in terms of the overall rankings by the end of the week. Moving on, let's talk about Jakobi Meyers. Jakobi Meyers very easily should have had himself a touchdown in that Raiders game. Unfortunately, was called back due to a penalty, and should have also had himself one less fumble attributed to his overall box score in that game. That being said, he's coming off of a week, 6 catches, 83 yards, a receiving touchdown, now takes on Miami. Their primary nickel back was slaughtered by Keenan Allen just a couple weeks back. 12 catches, 92 receiving yards, 0 touchdowns, but overall, incredible fantasy points. I'm expecting to see Jakobi Meyers in the slot position dominate, even though in week 1 against this defense only had 8.2 fantasy points. I'm expecting 10 or more within the given matchup as the primary number 1 receiving option of the New England Patriots offense. Moving on, Brandon Aiyuk. With Deebo Samuel probably missing another game here, Brandon Aiyuk pretty much is in a conversation going up against the Las Vegas Raiders where he certainly will have upside. The only question is, do they need Brandon Aiyuk to be relevant for them to win this game? I would say no, mainly because the entire offense of the Las Vegas Raiders has been nullified with the benching of Derek Carr. So therefore, I am excited about the potential of Brandon Aiyuk, especially coming off of a week where he had 7 targets, 5 catches, 81 yards against Washington's secondary that has played well. Going up against this defense should be an automatic play, but I'm not 100% bought in on the potential. Moving on, speaking of not being bought in, Mike Williams is another one of these players going up against Jalen Ramsey that I don't know if I can immediately trust. Similar to the same fashion that I didn't trust him last week going up against Stephon Gilmore in that given matchup, I'm feeling the same energy. Therefore, I do expect him to maybe put up 8 to 10 fantasy points if he gets lucky, similar to last week. But outside of that, in a half PPR scoring format, if he's not going to have an automatic touchdown incorporated with his scoreline, it's going to be tough to trust him anything higher than number 33. Moving on to number 34, it is Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk has been extremely inconsistent. There are 2 ways to get great performances out of Christian Kirk. He either scores a touchdown or goes for over 100 receiving yards. Going up against Houston secondary, it is a very low likelihood of both those things occurring. Therefore, I would rather opt towards trusting guys like Travis Etienne, Zay Jones, and Evan Ingram within that offense, who have certainly been featured most recently in comparison to Christian Kirk. Therefore, we have him as a number 34. Still a decent option, but one that I'm far less excited about playing in the given week. Moving on to Diontae Johnson at number 35. This could very easily be swapped with George Pickens. Very easily. But the fact of the matter is, Diontae Johnson continues to get a pretty streamlined volume of targets. And if he continues to see that with Kenny Pickett, despite the fact that the last time this team took on the Baltimore Ravens, it was with Mitchell Trubisky, considering Pickett was in the concussion protocol. And Trubisky certainly did help him get to that 10-point fantasy range. We still saw Diontae Johnson accumulate 7 targets, 5 catches, 64 yards last week against the Las Vegas Raiders. As long as he is continuing to be in that same conversation, should be a decent play. Moving on to the final option I wanted to mention, it is Richie James Jr. Richie James Jr. takes on the Indianapolis Colts. They will not have their primary nickel, which is Kenny Moore. And there's another primary reason why Keenan Allen had an incredible week on Monday Night Football against that defense. When Richie James Jr. is unleashed on this defense as the primary slot receiver, I'm expecting, of course, Isaiah Rodgers and Stefon Gilmore, assuming they're both healthy, to lock down guys like Isaiah Hodgins and or Darius Slayton, therefore opening a more opportunity for Richie James to be the primary number 1 of this offense, and of course, a startable option in the given week. That's going to cover it for us today. Thank you everybody for watching. Those were my top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 17 of the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, before I close out today's video, another reminder, if you have not yet already and you didn't go ahead and comment it on a different video, perhaps yesterday's video for the running back rankings, if you haven't commented your overall roster, go down to the comment section, leave it down there in terms of your starting lineup. I want to know which players can be correlated for helping us lead to a fantasy championship. I'm assuming someone like Justin Jefferson is probably on majority of rosters, but I wanted to go ahead, get a little bit of a glimpse as to how we have all managed to get to the fantasy playoffs, which teams, which specific players have allowed us to reach our specific goal in 2022. Be sure to go ahead and click the like button down below. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about quarterback and tight end rankings before Thursday night's game. Outside of that, Saturday live stream, 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Sunday morning live stream, 8 to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. All that in order to help you guys capture a championship. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure to check out PrizePicks. Go ahead, take advantage of some of their entries tonight in terms of the NBA, the NFL, and going forward. Be sure to use promo code Andrew. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.